There are 10 mental traps that keep a person stuck in an ordinary life. And the most dangerous part is this. These traps don't look like traps. They look like normal thoughts. They look like caution. They look like tiredness. They look like a lack of time. They look like protection. They look like just a difficult phase. But little by little, they make a person give up on themselves without even realizing it. They still wake up. They still go to work. They still pay their bills. They still talk to people. They still smile when they need to smile. But inside, something starts to fade. Ambition gets weaker. Vision gets smaller. Courage disappears. And life, which once felt full of possibilities, starts shrinking into a routine with no fire, no direction, and no power. Outwitting the Devil by Napoleon Hill revealed an uncomfortable truth. The greatest danger to a human being is not lack of opportunity. It's not lack of talent. It's not lack of luck. It's losing control of your own mind. Because when you don't govern your thoughts, anything else will. Fear will. Opinions will. Distractions will. Your environment will. And when everything is controlling you, except your own consciousness, your life begins to drift. You don't notice it on the first day. You don't notice it in the first week. But a year goes by. 5 years go by. 10 years go by. And then one day, you look back and feel a silent pain. I could have been so much more. But today, we're not just talking about failure. We're talking about the invisible traps that create failure before it ever shows up. Because before someone loses money, they lose direction. Before they lose opportunities, they lose clarity. Before they lose years of their life, they lose small commands over their mind every single day. And in this video, you're going to discover the 10 mental traps that keep millions of people stuck, repeating the same patterns, delaying the same dreams, and calling it destiny, when in reality, it's conditioning. And at some point in this video, you may recognize one of these traps operating inside your own life. Maybe it's procrastination. Maybe it's the fear of criticism. Maybe it's indecision. Maybe it's the habit of thinking small. Or maybe it's something even more dangerous. The feeling that you are living, but not truly leading your own life. So pay attention until the end. Because the trap you don't recognize is the one that keeps controlling you. And the moment you finally see what's been holding your mind hostage, you begin to take your power back. Before we move forward, I want to invite you to do something simple but meaningful. If this message resonates with you, if you feel ready to stop living on autopilot and start taking control of your own mind, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. Here on Prosperity Laws, we study timeless principles of the mind, prosperity, and self-mastery. So you don't just desire a better life, you become the person capable of building it. And comment below, I take back control of my mind. Because a conscious decision, written down, can be the first sign that you're no longer willing to live in drift. Now, let's begin. Trap 1. The trap of lack of purpose. There is a silent trap that destroys more lives than failure, more than lack of money, and even more than fear, the lack of purpose. Without a clear direction, life starts running on autopilot. Decisions stop being intentional and become reactions. Routine takes over, days repeat themselves, and everything feels normal, even when nothing is truly moving forward. That's how mental drift begins. In Outwitting the Devil, Napoleon Hill presents an uncomfortable idea. A mind without a definite purpose becomes vulnerable to external influence. Without a clear target, there is no filter. Any opinion carries weight. Any distraction feels acceptable. Any doubt finds room. When there is no direction, everything gets in. And when everything gets in, control is lost. No one consciously decides to live an ordinary life. What actually happens is far more subtle. There was never a clear decision to live something greater. And that empty space doesn't stay empty. It gets filled by the environment, by circumstances, and by other people's expectations. That's why so many people feel like something is off, but can't explain exactly what it is. The problem isn't what is happening. It's what was never defined. Without purpose, there may still be movement, but there is no real progress. There are tasks, responsibilities, obligations, but no central axis pulling everything toward a meaningful result. Without that axis, difficulty feels heavier. Distraction becomes stronger. Fatigue becomes an excuse to stop. What separates those who build something extraordinary from those who simply go through life is not talent, and it's not luck. It's clarity. People who move forward know what they want. They know why they want it. And that clarity organizes their thinking, their decisions, and their actions. While most people react to what shows up, a few choose to build what they decided. Without purpose, the mind starts looking for compensation. Immediate pleasure becomes more attractive. Distraction becomes constant. Time slips away without resistance. And over time, this stops feeling wrong. Days without progress start to feel normal. No growth, no real evolution. When this pattern repeats long enough, the outcome is predictable. An entire life can pass without ever building what once felt important. So here is a direct question. Are you moving forward or just staying busy? There is a difference between doing things and building something, between filling time and directing your own existence. As long as there is no clear definition of what you want, life will keep pulling you toward what is easiest. And what is easiest rarely leads where you truly want to go. But the moment that decision is made with precision, everything begins to reorganize. Focus shifts. Choices gain intention. Behavior becomes directed. And your relationship with time changes, because a person with purpose does not waste their life. Now that you see the first trap clearly, you can begin to recognize the next one, because even when clarity starts to appear, something can still block all progress. Indecision. Trap 2. The trap of indecision. Clarity alone is not enough. Many people reach a point where they begin to understand what they want. There is a desire to change, to grow, to build something greater. But then something subtle steps in and stops everything. Indecision. Not the obvious kind, not dramatic, but the quiet hesitation that delays action. The internal debate that never ends. The constant need to think a little more before moving. At first, it feels intelligent, careful, responsible. But over time, it becomes a form of paralysis. Because every delayed decision weakens something inside you. Self-trust weakens, momentum fades, confidence erodes. And slowly, the mind loses its authority over action. In Outwitting the Devil, Napoleon Hill points out that people who drift are often those who fail to make definite decisions. They wait, they analyze, they hesitate, and while they are still thinking, life keeps moving. Opportunities don't wait. Time doesn't pause, and the cost of hesitation begins to accumulate silently. One delayed decision becomes a pattern. That pattern becomes a habit. That habit becomes a life. This is how people lose years. Not because they chose the wrong path, but because they never fully chose any path. There is a hidden danger here. Indecision creates the illusion of progress. It feels like you are being strategic, but nothing is being built. No execution. No real movement. Just mental activity without transformation. And the longer this continues, the harder it becomes to break, because the mind starts associating action with risk and hesitation with safety. That is where the trap locks in. At some point, the person is no longer avoiding decisions. They are avoiding responsibility, avoiding exposure, avoiding the possibility of failure. And without realizing it, they are also avoiding growth. Understand this clearly. Every decision carries risk. But indecision carries a guarantee, the guarantee that nothing changes. People who move forward are not the ones who always make perfect choices. They are the ones who decide and adjust. They act and refine. They move and learn. Indecision keeps everything trapped in potential. Ideas stay in the mind. Plans stay on paper. Dreams stay in imagination. Nothing crosses into reality. So here's the question. How many times have you delayed something you already knew you needed to do? How many decisions are waiting for the right moment? And how much time has that hesitation already cost you? Because the truth is simple. The right moment rarely arrives. It is created through decision. The moment you decide, energy shifts. Clarity sharpens. Action begins. Momentum builds. Without that decision, everything remains frozen. And that is how dreams disappear, without ever being tested. Now that you see this trap clearly, the next one goes even further. It doesn't just delay action. It kills it completely. Procrastination. Trap 3. The trap of procrastination, indecision, delays your life. Procrastination quietly steals it. This trap doesn't look like failure. It feels harmless. It sounds reasonable. I'll do it later. Tomorrow will be better. I just need the right moment. And nothing happens. Procrastination is not just delaying a task. It is avoiding the version of yourself that action requires. Because action demands effort, discipline, discomfort, responsibility. So the mind looks for an easier option, something lighter, something immediate. Distractions become more attractive. Small pleasures feel urgent. Low-effort activities start to feel justified. And what actually matters gets pushed aside. In Outwitting the Devil, Napoleon Hill exposes a powerful truth. Procrastination is one of the main forces that keeps people in a state of drift. Because without action, there is no momentum. And without momentum, nothing grows. Every time something important is delayed, the cost is not just time. Energy is lost, clarity fades, confidence weakens. And slowly, belief in yourself starts to erode. Your mind begins to recognize a pattern. You say you will do something. You don't do it. At first, it seems small, but repetition turns it into identity. I'll do it later becomes your default response. And later slowly becomes never. That is how people lose years. Not through one major mistake, but through thousands of small postponements. Here is what most people don't understand. Procrastination is emotional. It is not about time. It is not about being busy. It is about how you feel when you think about the task. If it feels uncomfortable, overwhelming, uncertain, the mind looks for relief. And the fastest way to feel relief is to delay. But that relief is temporary. Because the task remains, waiting. And every time it is avoided, the weight increases. The resistance grows. What was once simple becomes intimidating. This is how procrastination transforms small actions into heavy burdens. Understand this clearly. You do not need motivation to act. You need movement. Action creates clarity. Action builds confidence. Action generates energy. Waiting does the opposite. Waiting drains you. Waiting confuses you. Waiting weakens your sense of control. People who build something meaningful do not wait to feel ready. They act while it is uncomfortable. They start before it is perfect. They move before they feel confident. Because they understand a principle most people ignore. Motion breaks resistance. The moment you begin, the weight starts to lift. The task becomes clearer. The fear becomes smaller. And the mind shifts from avoidance to engagement. So here's the question. What in your life is being delayed right now? What are you avoiding that you already know matters? What have you been pushing to tomorrow for weeks or even years? Because the longer you wait, the more you train your mind to stay stuck, and the more you act, the more you train your mind to move. That is the difference between people who remain in potential and those who turn potential into reality. Now that you understand this trap, the next one goes deeper. It does not just stop action. It makes you afraid of being seen. The fear of other people's opinions. Trap 4. The trap of fear of other people's opinions, procrastination, stops action. But there is something even more subtle and often more powerful. The fear of being judged. This trap doesn't just affect what you do. It affects who you allow yourself to become. At first, it feels small. You hesitate before speaking. You rethink what you are about to say. You adjust your behavior, depending on who is watching. Nothing extreme, nothing obvious. But over time, something shifts. Instead of asking, "What do I want?" you start asking, "How will this look?" And that question begins to control everything. Your choices, your voice, your direction. In Outwitting the Devil, Napoleon Hill highlights that fear of criticism is one of the strongest forces keeping people mentally controlled, because the moment you depend on approval, you lose independence. And without independence, there is no real power. Think about how many decisions are never made, not because they are wrong, but because they might be judged. How many ideas are never expressed, not because they lack value, but because they might be criticized. How many paths are never taken, not because they are impossible, but because they are different. This is how people shrink their own lives, not through failure, but through self-censorship. They start editing themselves, filtering their thoughts, holding back their potential, all to avoid discomfort, all to avoid rejection, all to avoid standing out. And slowly, without realizing it, they stop living their own life. They begin living a version that is acceptable to others, a version that fits expectations, a version that avoids conflict, a version that feels safe. But safety, in this context, is a trap, because what protects you from criticism also prevents growth. Every time you choose approval over truth, you weaken your identity. Every time you silence your direction, you lose clarity. Every time you avoid exposure, you lose opportunity. And the more this repeats, the deeper the pattern becomes. The mind starts associating visibility with danger and invisibility with comfort. That is where the trap locks in. At that point, the person is no longer afraid of judgment. They are afraid of being seen. Understand this clearly. If your life is being shaped by other people's opinions, then your life is not truly yours. People who build something meaningful accept a simple truth. Criticism is inevitable. Misunderstanding is inevitable. Judgment is inevitable. But none of that is as costly as abandoning your own direction. Because when you abandon your direction, you abandon your future. Those who move forward are not the ones who avoid judgment. They are the ones who refuse to let it define them. They act anyway. They speak anyway. They move anyway. Even when it's uncomfortable. Even when it's uncertain. Even when it exposes them. Because they understand something most people avoid. Being seen is part of becoming. So here's the question. How much of your life has been shaped by the fear of what others might think? What have you avoided? Not because you couldn't do it, but because of how it might look. Because every time you choose silence over truth, you trade your potential for temporary comfort. And over time, that trade becomes your reality. Now that you see this trap clearly, the next one goes even deeper. It doesn't just affect your decisions. It shapes the way you see your entire future. The fear of poverty. Trap 5. The trap of fear of poverty, fear of judgment, makes you hold back. Fear of poverty makes you shrink. Not just financially, mentally, emotionally, strategically. This fear doesn't always appear as panic. It often disguises itself as being realistic, as playing safe, as avoiding unnecessary risk. And over time, it begins to shape the entire way you think, the decisions you make, the opportunities you reject, the level of life you allow yourself to pursue. In Outwitting the Devil, Napoleon Hill explains that fear of poverty is one of the most powerful forces used to control human behavior. Because a person who fears loss will settle for less. They lower their expectations. They reduce their ambition. They prioritize safety over growth. And slowly, their world becomes smaller, more predictable, more limited. This is how invisible boundaries are created, not around what is possible, but around what feels safe. And those boundaries become a prison, because the mind begins to evaluate everything through the lens of loss. What if this doesn't work? What if I lose money? What if I fail? These questions repeat. They build hesitation. They create resistance. They demand certainty before action. But certainty rarely exists, so action rarely happens. And when action stops, progress stops. This is how people stay in the same financial reality for years. Not because they lack intelligence, not because they lack ability, but because they are conditioned to avoid risk at all costs. And avoiding risk often means avoiding opportunity. Here is the deeper layer of this trap. Fear of poverty shifts identity. Instead of seeing yourself as someone who can create, expand, and multiply, you begin to see yourself as someone who must protect what you have. That shift changes everything, because now your thinking becomes defensive. You stop building. You start guarding. You stop expanding. You start surviving. And survival mode is the opposite of prosperity. When the mind is focused on survival, it becomes reactive, anxious, short-term. It looks for immediate security instead of long-term growth. And that limits vision, limits action, limits results. Understand this clearly. You don't overcome the fear of poverty by avoiding it. You overcome it by developing the ability to move forward despite uncertainty. People who build wealth are not fearless. They simply refuse to let fear define their limits. They learn, they adapt, they take calculated risks. And most importantly, they trust their ability to recover, adjust, and grow. That trust breaks the trap. Because once you believe you can rebuild, fear loses its control. So here is the question. How many of your decisions are being influenced by the fear of losing what you have? How many opportunities have you avoided, not because they were wrong, but because they felt uncertain? Because the longer you live under this fear, the more your life contracts, and the more you move beyond it, the more your world expands. Now that you understand this trap, the next one is even more subtle. It doesn't just shape your decisions. It shapes your thinking without you even realizing it. Your environment. Trap 6. The trap of a contaminated environment fear of poverty shapes your decisions. But there is something even more subtle, something most people completely underestimate. Your environment. Not just the place where you live, but the voices you hear, the conversations you are exposed to, the content you consume, the people you spend time with. Because whether you realize it or not, your environment is constantly shaping your mind. And the most dangerous part is this. It happens silently. No warning, no resistance. Just gradual influence. A phrase repeated. A belief reinforced. A pattern observed. And over time, it becomes your way of thinking. In Outwitting the Devil, Napoleon Hill makes it clear that a mind without strong internal control will absorb whatever surrounds it. And what surrounds you eventually becomes you. If you are surrounded by doubt, you begin to doubt. If you are surrounded by negativity, you begin to expect the worst. If you are surrounded by limitation, you begin to accept limitation as reality. And after a while, it no longer feels like influence. It feels like truth. That is where the trap becomes dangerous. Because now you are not just exposed to the environment, you are aligned with it. Think about how many people say things like, "That's just how life is. That's not for people like us. That's impossible. These are not facts. They are absorbed beliefs." And once they settle into the mind, they start shaping everything. Your expectations, your decisions, your results. A contaminated environment doesn't always look toxic. Sometimes it looks normal, familiar, comfortable, but it slowly limits your vision, limits your ambition, limits your sense of what is possible, because it reinforces the same level of thinking again and again. And without noticing, you become a reflection of that repetition. This is why so many people try to change their lives, but stay in the same results. They try to think differently, but remain surrounded by the same influences. They try to grow, but stay in the same mental atmosphere. And growth cannot survive in an environment that constantly pulls you back. Understand this clearly. Your mind is not isolated. It is adaptive. It reflects what it is exposed to. So if your environment is filled with distraction, negativity, and low-level thinking, your mind will mirror that, no matter how strong your intentions are. People who build something different make a conscious decision. They protect their environment. They choose what they listen to. They filter what they consume. They become selective about who they spend time with. Because they understand something most people ignore. Influence is inevitable. The only question is whether that influence is strengthening you or weakening you. And here is the shift that changes everything. You may not be able to change your external environment immediately, but you can begin to change your internal environment. What you read, what you watch, what you listen to, what you repeat to yourself. Those choices begin to reshape your thinking, and over time, they begin to reshape your reality. So here is the question. What kind of environment is shaping your mind right now? Is it expanding your vision or shrinking it? Is it pushing you forward or keeping you where you are? Because if your environment is not aligned with where you want to go, it will quietly keep you exactly where you are. Now that you understand this trap, the next one becomes even more personal. It doesn't come from outside. It comes from the patterns your own mind repeats every single day. Negative thinking. Trap 7. The trap of negative thinking. Your environment influences your mind. But there is something even more powerful. What your mind repeats when no one is watching. Negative thinking. Not just occasional doubt. Not just a bad day, but a pattern. A loop. A constant internal narrative that quietly shapes how you see everything. At first, it seems harmless. A thought of worry. A moment of pessimism. A quick assumption that something won't work. But when that pattern repeats, it becomes a lens. And once it becomes a lens, it starts distorting reality. In Outwitting the Devil, Napoleon Hill makes it clear that the mind, when not consciously directed, tends to drift toward fear, doubt, and negativity. Because negative thinking requires no effort. It is automatic. It is reactive. It is easy. But its consequences are not. A single negative thought is not the problem. The problem is repetition. Because what you repeat, you reinforce. And what you reinforce, you begin to believe. And once belief is formed, behavior follows. This is where the trap becomes dangerous. Because now, you are not just thinking negatively, you are operating from that thinking. You begin to expect failure. You anticipate problems. You assume limitations. And that expectation changes how you act. You hesitate more. You take fewer risks. You commit less energy. You abandon things earlier, not because reality demanded it, but because your thinking shaped it. This is how negative thinking becomes self-fulfilling. You expect less. You act with less intensity. You get less. And then you use the result to confirm the original thought. The cycle repeats, And over time, it becomes your identity. I'm not that type of person. That's not for me. Things never work out. These are not truths. They are patterns that have been repeated long enough to feel real. Understand this clearly. Your mind does not distinguish between what is real and what is repeated. If you tell yourself something often enough, your brain begins to accept it as fact. And once it becomes fact in your mind, it becomes a limit in your life. This is why negative thinking is so dangerous. Not because of what it says, but because of what it builds. It builds a mental environment where growth feels unlikely, where effort feels pointless, where possibility feels distant. And once that environment is established, even opportunities start to look like threats. People who break this pattern understand something critical. Thoughts are not commands. They are suggestions. And you don't have to accept every suggestion your mind produces. They become aware. They observe. They interrupt the pattern. And slowly, they replace it with something stronger. Clarity, intention, constructive focus. Because the goal is not to become blindly positive. The goal is to become mentally intentional. To choose what you reinforce. To choose what you focus on. To choose what you allow to grow inside your mind. So here's the question. What kind of thoughts are you repeating every day? Are they strengthening you or weakening you? Are they expanding your vision or shrinking it? Because whatever you repeat consistently will eventually shape your reality. Now that you understand this trap, the next one is even more deceptive because it doesn't look like weakness. It looks like intelligence. But it silently keeps people exactly where they are. The trap of intelligent excuses. Trap 8. The trap of intelligent excuses. Negative thinking weakens your internal dialogue. But there is a trap that feels far more convincing. Because it sounds logical. Intelligent excuses. Not the obvious kind. Not the lazy justification. But the well-structured reasoning that explains why you're not moving. I don't have enough time right now. I need to prepare more before I start. This isn't the right moment. I'll wait until things are more stable. Everything sounds reasonable. Everything makes sense. And that's exactly why it's dangerous. Because nothing gets questioned. Nothing gets challenged. Nothing changes. In Outwitting the Devil, Napoleon Hill makes it clear that people often justify their lack of action with explanations that protect their ego. Excuses don't just delay progress. They protect comfort. They protect identity. They protect the current version of you from being challenged. And the more intelligent the excuse, the harder it is to confront. Because it doesn't feel like avoidance. It feels like strategy. It feels like awareness. It feels like maturity. But behind that logic, there is usually fear. Fear of failure, fear of discomfort, fear of exposure, fear of not being enough. So instead of facing that fear directly, the mind builds a narrative that sounds acceptable, a story that explains why action can wait. And once that story is accepted, movement stops. Here is the hidden cost. Every time you justify an action, you reinforce it. You train your mind to find reasons not to move. And over time, this becomes automatic. A new opportunity appears. Your mind immediately looks for why it won't work. A new idea comes up. Your mind explains why now is not the right time. A new path presents itself. Your mind finds a logical reason to stay where you are. This is how potential gets buried under explanation. Not because the person lacks ability, but because they have become too good at justifying inaction. Understand this clearly. Excuses don't need to be false to be harmful. They only need to be convenient, because even a true limitation can become a permanent barrier if it is used as a reason to stop. People who move forward don't ignore reality. They simply refuse to let it define their limits. They acknowledge the challenge and move anyway. They adapt. They adjust. They find a way forward. Because they understand something most people avoid. Progress requires discomfort. Growth requires exposure. Change requires action before certainty. Excuses remove all of that. They create a safe space where nothing is demanded and nothing grows. So here's the question. What have you been explaining? Instead of changing, what have you been justifying? Instead of confronting, what story have you been telling yourself that sounds reasonable, but is actually keeping you stuck? Because the longer you protect your excuses, the longer they control your life. And the moment you stop explaining and start moving, everything begins to shift. Now that you see this trap clearly, the next one goes even deeper. Because even when you remove excuses, something else can still take control. Something that determines whether you follow through or fall back. Self-discipline. Trap 9. The trap of lack of self-discipline. Excuses keep you from starting. But even when you remove excuses, something else determines whether you continue. Self-discipline, or the lack of it. Because starting is not the real challenge. Continuing is. Following through when it's uncomfortable. Showing up when motivation is gone. Doing what needs to be done, even when you don't feel like it. That is where most people break. At the beginning, energy is high. There is excitement. There is intention. There is a sense of possibility. But as soon as resistance appears, that energy fades. And without discipline, everything collapses. In Outwitting the Devil, Napoleon Hill emphasizes that a person who cannot control themselves will be controlled by external forces. Because without internal command, your actions become dependent on mood, on circumstances, on how you feel in the moment. And feelings are unstable. They change constantly. One day you feel motivated. The next day you don't. One moment you feel confident. The next moment you hesitate. If your actions depend on that, your results will always be inconsistent. This is the core of the trap. A lack of self-discipline turns potential into inconsistency. You start something. You stop. You commit. You break it. You plan. You abandon it. And over time, a pattern forms. Not of failure, but of instability. And instability destroys progress. Because progress requires repetition, consistency, accumulation of effort over time. Without discipline, none of that exists. Everything becomes temporary, unfinished, interrupted. And here is the deeper consequence. You stop trusting yourself because your mind notices the pattern. You say you will do something, and you don't follow through. You set a goal, and you abandon it. You create a plan, and you break it. At some point, your own word loses value. And when that happens, confidence disappears. Not because you lack ability, but because you lack proof. Proof that you can rely on yourself. Understand this clearly. Self-discipline is not about restriction. It is about control. Control over your actions. Control over your time. Control over your direction. It is the ability to act independently of emotion. People who build something meaningful don't rely on feeling ready. They rely on structure, on commitment, on standards. They decide what needs to be done, and they do it, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's repetitive, even when it feels slow. Because they understand something most people ignore. Consistency creates power. Small actions, repeated daily, become unstoppable force. Without discipline, nothing compounds. Everything resets. Everything restarts. And life becomes a cycle of beginnings without completion. So here's the question. How consistent are you with what you say matters? How often do you follow through when no one is watching? Because discipline is built in those moments. In the choices no one sees. In the actions no one applauds. That is where identity is formed. And identity defines results. Now that you understand this trap, there is one final layer. the most dangerous one of all, because it is not a single behavior. It is a state, a condition that combines all the others and keeps a person stuck without even realizing it. Mental drift. Trap 10. The trap of mental drift. Lack of discipline breaks consistency. But there is a final trap, the one that ties all the others together. Mental drift, not a single decision, not a single mistake, but a state, a way of living without conscious direction, a condition where the mind is no longer leading, only reacting. This is the most dangerous trap of all, because it doesn't feel like failure. It feels normal. You wake up, you go through your day, you complete tasks, you handle responsibilities. Everything appears functional. But beneath the surface, there is no control, no clear direction, no intentional construction of a future. In Outwitting the Devil, Napoleon Hill describes this state as drifting, a condition where a person is not actively choosing their path, but being carried by circumstances, habits, fears, and external influence. And the most dangerous part is this: the person doesn't realize it, because drift is comfortable. It avoids pressure. It avoids responsibility. It avoids confrontation. There is no need to decide, no need to commit, no need to take full ownership. Everything becomes passive, automatic, unquestioned, and slowly, control disappears. Life becomes a sequence of reactions. Instead of creating, you respond. Instead of directing, you follow. Instead of building, you maintain. This is how years pass unnoticed, not through collapse, but through slow disengagement, small compromises, repeated distractions, delayed decisions, unfinished actions. All the previous traps combine here: lack of purpose, indecision, procrastination, fear, excuses, weak discipline. Everything feeds into this state, and once someone is fully in drift, they stop questioning it. It becomes their reality. They start to believe, this is just how life is. This is normal. This is all there is. But it's not. It's a condition. And like any condition, it can be changed, but only when it is recognized. Understand this clearly. Drift is not an event. It is a process. A gradual loss of awareness. A gradual surrender of control. And the longer it continues, the harder it becomes to break. Because the mind adapts to it, it becomes comfortable with mediocrity, comfortable with repetition, comfortable with limitation. That is where potential dies, not in failure, but in acceptance. People who break out of this state do something different. They interrupt the pattern. They question their current direction. They take responsibility. They make conscious decisions. They reclaim control over their thoughts, their actions, their time, because they understand something most people never confront. If you don't take control of your mind, something else will. And whatever controls your mind, controls your life. So here is the final question. Are you living with intention? Or are you drifting? Are your days being directed? Or are they being consumed? Because the difference between those two states is the difference between a life built with purpose and a life that slowly fades without one. And the moment you become aware of that difference is the moment everything can begin to change. Reclaiming control of your mind, you've just seen the 10 traps, not as ideas, but as patterns that quietly shape a person's entire life. Lack of purpose, indecision, procrastination, fear of judgment, fear of poverty, a contaminated environment, negative thinking, intelligent excuses, lack of self-discipline, mental drift. Individually, each one seems manageable, almost harmless, but together, they form a system that keeps people stuck, distracted, reactive, living below their potential without even realizing it. And the most dangerous part is this: None of these traps force themselves on you. They are accepted, repeated, reinforced, over time, until they become your normal. But here is the truth most people never confront. What is repeated becomes identity, and identity becomes destiny. So if these patterns have been shaping your life, then your results are not random. They are the natural outcome of what your mind has been conditioned to do. And that means something powerful. If the patterns can be learned, they can be unlearned. If they can be reinforced, they can be replaced. Everything begins with awareness, because the trap you cannot see is the one that continues to control you. But the moment you recognize it, you create distance from it. And in that distance, you regain power. From that point forward, change becomes possible, not instant, not easy, but real. Because now, your actions are no longer automatic. They become intentional. You begin to define your purpose. You begin to make decisions faster. You begin to act before you feel ready. You begin to detach from other people's opinions. You begin to take calculated risks. You begin to protect your environment. You begin to observe your thoughts. You begin to eliminate excuses. You begin to build discipline. And slowly, you stop drifting. You start directing. That is the shift. That is the turning point. Not when everything changes at once, but when you stop allowing your mind to operate unconsciously. Because the person who controls their mind controls their life, and the person who doesn't will always be controlled by something else. So now the responsibility is yours, not to be perfect, not to change everything overnight, but to stop ignoring what you now see. Because awareness without action changes nothing, and action without consistency doesn't last. So start small, but start intentionally. Choose one pattern to break, one decision to make, one action to take, and follow through. Because every time you act with awareness, you weaken the traps. And every time you repeat that, you rebuild your identity. Now, before you leave this video, I want you to make something clear. Not to me, to yourself. Go into the comments and write, "I take back control of my mind," because that sentence is not just a comment. It is a decision. And decisions, when repeated with action, become transformation. If this message resonated with you, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. Here on Prosperity Laws, we don't just talk about motivation. We train the mind for clarity, discipline, and real power. And if you stay here, you won't just hear these principles. You will start to live them. Now remember, your life doesn't change when you learn something new. It changes when you become someone new. And that begins the moment you decide to take control.